Hello and welcome to the Introduction to Wool Embroidery class with Stuart Moores Textiles plant-dyed wool embroidery floss. My name is Shayla and I am the artist and owner of Stuart Moores Textiles. I'm really excited to be offering this class online for the first time. It is by far my most popular in-person class, and now you can take it from the comfort of your own home. We'll start off by talking about what is in your kit for this class, which you can order on our website at stuartmoorestextiles.com or on our Etsy shop. We are going to be using linen stitching cloth today, and it's important that you use linen when you use wool embroidery floss, and we'll chat about that more later, but that is ready to go in your kit. The printed pattern you'll find in your kit, as well as 2 needles, one for embroidery and one for sewing your biscornu together when we finish our project. Another thing you'll find is this floss holder. You'll see later on in the class why this is important, but this is my favorite floss holder. It's brass and I just had to put these in this kit because I use them, they're gorgeous and I love them. Next, we've got a friction pen, which is an erasable fabric pen that we can draw our pattern with. And then finally, we have all the wool that's in your kit. On the right, you see the wool that comes with your kit. On the left, you'll notice that I have a few extra colors in there, one extra color, and I'm only using that for this video so you can see different stitches next to each other, just to let you know. All right, let's start off by transferring your pattern. I'm going to use my friction pen, and I'm going to place my pattern right side up on a light board, and then place the fabric on top of my pattern and simply trace. If you don't have a light board, this one's only $15, but you can just use a window. A quick introduction to wool embroidery floss. It is much thinner than normal embroidery floss here on the right. It is going to take about 2 lengths of wool embroidery floss to equal the thickness of a traditional cotton embroidery floss, like this project that I did. You'll also notice that it's a bit shinier, the cotton embroidery floss, and the wool embroidery floss is a lot more textural and it's not as shiny. And it has a very vintage look that I absolutely adore. The embroidery hoop that you use for this project is your choice. This kit doesn't come with an embroidery hoop because everybody has their own preference, and I want you to feel comfortable while you're stitching. I would like to suggest though that if you are using a wooden embroidery hoop like this one, that you wrap the inside ring before you begin. The reason we do this is to add a little bit of friction to make sure that our pattern stays in place for the entire stitching project. In order to create that friction, I'm just going to tear a length of fabric and wrap it diagonally around the inner ring and secure it with a simple safety pin. It's inexpensive and easy, and this will keep your project in place for the entire time you're stitching. Next up, you'll notice that the needle set comes with 2 needles. It's kind of odd, but we are going to use the tapestry needle for embroidery and the embroidery needle for sewing. More on that later. So you'll notice in this video that I am creating a smaller project that incorporates each of the elements in the pattern that you have in your kit. It's a little bit different, but it's a smaller version that I can fit in the frame and show you each element of this project in one very small space. And this is what we're making today. It's a biscornu, which is just a fancy French word for pincushion. All right, let's get stitching. So I'm going to start with the pink embroidery floss in your kit that is called Bougainvillea. It is one of my favorites. And we are going to hold this thread double for the flower section, and I'll just tie a knot at the bottom. I'm going to enter my work from the back, but I'm not going to pull it all the way through to the end. I'm going to hang on to it, make sure my tension is even, and that I feel comfortable before I start stitching. I'm going to pop my needle back through the other side, and I'm just going to catch the needle through the knot at the end of my doubled up thread. I'll give you a closer look here. And the reason why I'm doing that is because we are using stitching linen for wool embroidery floss, and it's a little bit looser weave than some other things that you could be using. So I don't want to make sure at any point in my process that the knot slips through to the other side. So I'm just going to catch it. Also, because my project is white and I'm not using a backing cloth, which I'll talk more about later, I want to make sure that my knot is not visible in the little tails that come off of my knot. So when I do the catching thing right on the other side, it'll just make sure that the knot is moved a little bit towards the center and that it's not going to move around and be visible from the other side of my finished project. So the first thing I'm going to do is make 4 stitches on either side at north, south, west, and east. And the reason that I'm doing that is because I want to set up my stitches and fill them in between these 4 lines to keep them generally straight and radiating from the center as I stitch. I have found over the years of many projects similar to this one that if I start in one place and try to stack up my stitches next to each other, that they tend to get wonky if I don't first set up a structure for the stitches to keep them more even as I work. So as you can see, I'm just going around the circle. If I enter my thread from front to back on the inside of this flower, I'm going to start the next stitch in between the last 2 vertical stitches on the inside also. So when I flip over this project, you're going to notice that there aren't a lot of excess thread that's going through the center of these 2 concentric circles. And I'll just continue in this way, going all the way around. If I finish one stitch on the outer circle, I'm going to start the next stitch on the outer circle, go in on the inner circle, and then when I start my next stitch, I'm going to start it again from the center. And like I said, the reason why I do this is because I don't want to build up a lot of thread in the center of these 2 circles. And don't be super worried about hitting these lines exactly. And the reason for that is there are no perfect circles in nature, and we don't want them in our nature-inspired project. So I'll continue doing this, going all the way around my circles, each time just making a line in between the last 2 parallel lines in my flower. And I'm going to continue to do this until the inner circle of my flower is completely full of stitches. As you can see here, the inside line has totally been filled up with radiating stitches. I don't want these to be too crowded, so that is perfect. And if I see anything that has just a little bit of gap, I'll add 1 more radiating stitch. But like I said, we don't want this to be too crowded. When I feel like it is completely full, I am going to switch to the outer edge. And I am going to use a orange floss, held double again for this. But what's really important that you know is that in your kit and in the project that you see, that's my final project in the kit, I am still using the color Bougainvillea. The reason why I'm using this color in this video is because I want you to see what I am doing when I make these flowers, and you see the difference in the stitches. Because now I'm going to go the other direction. I'm going to start from the outside rim, and I'm going to place my stitches only where you see the white sort of like pizza pie shapes, triangles, on the outside of this circle. I'm not going all the way to the inner circle now. I'm just filling in the gaps on the outer circle. But like I said, when you do this with your own project, it is all pink. And that's why when you see the final circle and you see the final flower, it looks like a very textural layer of pink petals instead of a multicolored flower. I like using two colors on top of each other like that because it gives the flower a lot of depth, as it wouldn't if you were just doing circles, circles, circles that were all perfect and just in a very unnatural manner. And you can see that when you place the wool in between the other lines that you have made with your new outside stitches, it creates this really nice texture where it sort of pushes the other radiating lines that you made in the last section and adds this really fluffy depth that I love about wool embroidery. One of my favorite things about using wool embroidery floss is the kind of texture and depth that it can offer and the way that it layers onto the canvas in this really lovely way that is quite soft and quite gorgeous. So here's a little close-up view of what I'm doing, and you'll see the way that the stitches all sit really nicely together when I do these stitches, doing the radiating stitches going out first and then coming back to the outer edge and doing the inner facing stitches in the second step. Now is a really good time to talk about the differences between wool embroidery floss and traditional embroidery floss. As you notice, when I'm making my embroidery floss strands, I'm not using them very long because wool embroidery floss is not as tough as that very, very, very tough cotton embroidery floss that we're all used to. And every time you put wool embroidery floss through any sort of fabric, or if you're doing a needlepoint canvas or something like that, the wool fibers are rubbing against the edges and it will start to degrade or rub away or rub as you use it. So we just want to be careful that we're using shorter strands than we might with cotton embroidery floss. And also we want to make sure we're using the right cloth. So I'm using linen in this for this project, and generally you'll find that wool embroidery is done with linen stitching cloth. If you use a very tight weave, you will find it a little bit more difficult to work with one strand of floss over a very long time. Now just quickly, I'm going to show you something. Once you have a little bit of wool built up on the back of your project, you don't even need to tie knots on the back side. You can just pull the wool through your project 3 or 4 times in different directions, snip it off, and you're golden. Next, I'm going to switch to the color Twilight, which is everybody's favorite, just so that you know. And I'm going to start stitching this time with a single strand of floss. And again, I'm just going to tie a simple knot in the back, which is a lovely thing about wool embroidery. You can use knots, or you can do that method that I just showed you by weaving the wool in between the back stitches of your embroidery floss on the back side if you already have them. It's not always an option if there isn't any other stitching around, but it's something to always keep in mind. I prefer to do it actually. So for this stem, I want it to be very slender. And I am just going to show you once again the basic step that I use in all of these stems for this entire biscornu. I'm going to make one stitch, back stitch through the center of that last stitch, and then make another stitch. Coming back for the third stitch, I'll again come back through the center of the last stitch and come down for my third stitch. And I'll keep working in this manner until I get the base of my twin leaf set. I'll finish this stitch at the base and pop my needle back up behind the fabric at the tip of the right leaf, or the left leaf, it doesn't matter which one you do first. And I'll bring it back through the same hole I just popped it through on my last stitch. Once you have this stitch in place, this is the foundation for the rest of the stitches on your leaf, and you're just going to make parallel stitches, slightly shorter each time on top of the leaf, and slightly shorter each time on the bottom of the leaf. There's no reason for any of these stitches to be radiating in any direction. They are just parallel stitches, slightly shorter on the top and the bottom of the first stitch that you made for this leaf. It's so simple, and it looks just like a leaf. I love it. Once you finish this leaf, you'll do the exact same thing going from the base of the leaf to the top corner and making parallel stitches on either side. Very simple. Next, I'll continue stitching down to the base of my leaf in the exact same stitch that I just showed you up above for the beginning. When I tie off this, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm just going to tie a little knot because I don't want my knots to be seen from the other side of the fabric. So I'm going to use the previous stitches and double knot and just snip off my thread so that it doesn't leave any excess on either side that'll show through for my final project. Next, using the same color of plant-dyed wool embroidery floss, Twilight, I'm going to start the big leaf with one giant stitch that won't be seen in the end, going from the bottom tip of the leaf to the top tip of the leaf. Next, I'm going to make a series of stitches that I always tell my students are done in pairs and to think of them as actually being one stitch. And the reason for that is because we are creating stitches over and over and over again, and in order for them to look really clean and neat, it's important that we make these two stitches, which I like to refer to as one set of stitches, in the exact same way each time. And I always find it helpful to remember them as a set that has two stitches, but one stitch in total of two mirrored stitches. So the first thing we're going to do, as you can see, I'm going from the upper right and making a down stitch just over the center line, and then coming up on the other side and doing the exact same thing in the opposite direction. When I put my needle back in for the second portion of the stitch, it is at the exact same place on the other side of the center stitch that my last stitch came out. And the reason I do that is because these two stitches should basically always mirror each other and should always be at the same level. The base of each stitch inside of this two stitch set is going to be at the same level. So I've just said that twice because it's important. The other important part of this stitch set that I want to make clear is that we are doing the same thing every single time. If the right stitches are underneath the left stitches, we are going to do that every single time. So as you can see, when I am stitching from left to just over to the right side of the center stitch, and then on the other side from the right to just to the left side of the center stitch, I am going to do that always. The left stitch will always be under the right stitch. Keep it working your way down the leaf, and you can tell pretty soon whether or not the stitch pattern is looking like it's working because it looks like a leaf. Very, very, very leaf-like. This is something that is often a place where a lot of my students get tripped up because they start noticing that maybe the center stitches are getting a bit longer, you can always go back and fill in these stitches. So don't worry about making them, if they look a little bit off and having to pull it all back out. You can always go back and fill in any gaps that you find. I try to make my stitches on the outside of the leaves very close to the last one and put the most amount of distance between each stitch set when you go through the center of the stitch. When I get to the bottom of my leaf, it can get a little bit tight in this area. So just be mindful of that before you end and make sure that you have filled in the whole leaf before moving on to the next stage, even if the stitches are quite small. Next, I'm going to hop over to the center, but make that little stem part before I move on to the next step on either side. And I'm going to do the same thing that I've just done for the other leaf on the other side. Very simple, very easy, and I bet you a lot of money, because I have taught so many people, that this leaf is going to look even better than the first time you tried it. And if you're new to wool embroidery, it can seem a little bit daunting, but I guarantee you by the time you get to the second leaf, you're going to be an expert. So like I said in the last leaf, when you add space to these, if you are stitching too tight, you want to make sure that the outside, when you start your stitch sets, that you are putting your next set of stitches pretty close to where they are on the outside of the leaf. But if you need to start working faster down the leaf because your stitches are starting to get more like a line than like a V, just add a little bit of distance at the center of your stitches from the last center of your stitch. So as you can see, you've built up a lot of wool on the back side of this, which is great because we can easily hide our knot for the next section if you make a knot. But what I'm going to do is what I highly suggest is just go in 3 or 4 different directions, pull your wool through any stitches and just clip it off. Next, I'm going to switch over to the gingerbread color. And again, I'm going to hold it double for this section. Okay, so something I want to tell you about this section is that I have been doing wool embroidery for a while now, and I like to, when I do shows, teach classes because I'll sell my plant-dyed wool embroidery floss, and then I'll teach classes and teach people how to make the things that I make with wool embroidery. And something I want to mention at this point is this is a stitch that I have called a faux French knot. I have taught people in many different countries, in many different parts of the US where I now live again. And if you tell people that a stitch is called something, in class we will talk for 45 minutes about how actually everybody was raised learning that the stitch was called something else, and all over the world the common name for stitches, just like plants, is different. So this I have started calling, and other things I call are, sometimes I make up the words, sometimes I use the actual words, but I don't want anybody to focus on what a stitch is called and if you are doing a stitch exactly the way that some book you found told you is the only way to do something like a back stitch, which is 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people. So I call this stitch the faux French knot, and I might be the only person on the planet who does that. And the reason is because they look at the end like sort of fuzzy little French knots. All I'm doing is putting my thread through my fabric and then just very delicately putting it back through my fabric, but not pulling it all the way to create these little loops. And I'm using my needle to just set them in place so that they don't pull all the way through. When I finish with these, I'm going to just pull my thread through the back of all these loops so that they're set in place on the back side of my fabric. And unless you're looking really close, they look a lot like a set of French knots. Not as neat if you are looking really close, but it adds this great fuzzy texture that I love. And if you're new to something like wool embroidery or embroidery in general, French knots are really difficult, and I don't want anybody to lose any texture on their project because they're intimidated. Just so you see, I've left a little space because we're going to change colors for the center of that. I'm not going to do it right now. Right now I'm going to thread my wool through all of those, the backside of all those stitches, just to secure them in place. As you can see, the wool starts to get a little bit built up on the back, and that's something we need to be conscious of the whole time we're working on this project. We don't want it to be very built up. This is more built up than I am used to, but it's difficult for me to have a camera in between me and my work, and I'm sort of working at a distance. Later in the video, I will show you what it looks like when I don't have a camera in front of my face, and so I can like look at my work. But because this is a biscornu, which is just a fancy name for a pincushion, it needs to be structural, so we're not using any sort of stabilizing cloth in the back. And that means that anything sticking out from our embroidery is going to show. So we're just going to be careful as we stitch to make sure stuff doesn't stick out. Just something to be conscious of as we stitch. It's not the end of the world if you can see a stray thread underneath your fabric, but we'll just make it a habit of not showing it. Holding the thread double with the same gingerbread color, I'm going to do these little 3-pronged leaves, and maybe one day I'm going to show you a carpet in my house that these cute little leaves are all over, and were the inspiration for these little tiny, they're almost like wheat, I don't know, or dandelion heads. They were inspired by a carpet, and they're so cute and so whimsical, and I add them to all of the patterns that I make. This is just a super simple three set where I just make 1 center long stitch and 2 V-shaped shorter stitches on either side. There's nothing very difficult about this stitch. It's just gorgeous. For the little thread, or the little stem that connects them, I will use a single thread, but I want to do the double fluffy stitches first, because it's easier to do all of the double stitches first before you go back to single thread. I don't recommend trying to cut it off half of the stitch in between stitches, but I will be honest, I have done it myself before because I was running low on thread. So do what you need to do. As you can see, I finished all the seed heads for each of these little tiny wheat-like flowers, plants. And then next, I'm just going to take a single strand of the gingerbread and just fill in the gaps. I'm not going to do the same thing I did with the other stem. This time, instead of doing a back stitch that splits the previous stitch, I am simply going to put a bunch of seed stitches next to each other, a bunch of small stitches just in a row next to each other. The reason I'm going to do that is because I like when I create things for them to have different textures, especially if they're right next to each other. So when I created this pattern, I made the simple different stitch in one stem next to another simple stitch that is a different stem, but they're different in texture and they look different, and it just adds a different kind of depth to a project that I prefer. If you like to dissect the stitches and do the one that we did for the other stem, you're more than welcome to do that. Just something that I prefer when I'm working on a project, to make things different in each section. This stitch is so simple, and I really like it for outlining things. You can use it pretty much on any embroidery project, and it adds, if you add it to a color and just outline it with a slightly different color with this simple stitch, it adds a really nice simple depth that I like to use all the time, which is just something to know when you start working on your own projects. I do encourage you to draw your own embroidery projects. Of course, I would also love it if you bought all of the Stuart Moores Textiles embroidery projects, but Don't be afraid to start drawing your own patterns and work on your own projects and create, a really cool house that's full of all of the neat things that you like to make and the things that you've created and things that are meaningful to you. So here I have two little sticks, I would say. What do we call these? Little stem sticks. And all I'm going to do is just add a little V-stitch on either side. Very straightforward, but just in case you see those and you don't know what to do, I'm just doing the exact same thing that I did for the rest of the stem. All right. So next we are going to do these larger stems. As you can see in your pattern, they are circles. But the reason why I didn't add circles, I'm holding the wool double for this, just by the way, and I'm going to do some quick V stitches here that are just straight lines. Very simple. Very similar to the stitches that we did for the Twilight blue leaves from the first flower that we made, just parallel stitches, one shorter than the other on either side. But anyways, the reason why in this pattern that I am showing you, these long stems are straight lines. When you see your pattern, you will notice that they're circles. And the reason why I changed it while I demonstrated this project for you is because the circles for your pattern are actually smaller than what I will be showing you today. Because it's difficult to see when it's very small, I wanted you to get the largest possible example of these circles and how you create them. And so that is why it looks slightly different in this pattern than the pattern that you have, where you will see them as long lines of circles. And when you see the long lines of circles in your own project, they are quite small, and it did take me a few tries to get them even. If it's too small for you to make the circles that small, just take the small circles and pretend like two of them is one when you're stitching. There are literally no rules in this, and I just showed the things in your pattern as a guide, and you can change any aspect of this project because it is yours, and I want you to make it yours. A biscornu is a French word for pincushion, and I think this project would look really fantastic as a pillow or as anything else, a framed piece of embroidery. So don't feel like you need to fit exactly into the confines of what I've created. The reason why I make the biscornu, people pronounce it differently. The reason why I make them is because it's a really functional sample that you can make that you can use immediately. All right, so we are going to create these circle chain stitches, and I don't want you to be intimidated because this really freaks out my students, but don't be freaked out. I'm going to start by making one small seed stitch. You can do that. That's not hard. There we go. Very simple. Next, I'm going to make a stitch where I pop my needle out below that seed stitch and just push my needle through that stitch I just made. Not going into the fabric, just pulling the wool floss through, arranging it the way that I like it so it looks a little bit more like a circle, and putting that wool back in the same hole I just popped my needle through. I'm going to go back and make sure that it's sitting the way that I want it. And then I'm going to make one stitch through the center of that circle, and then a small seed stitch, just like the first one, just a seed stitch. Everybody can do that. That will be the anchor for my next stitch. And that was one stitch. Like I said before, when I was showing you the big leaf, I think it's really important to think of these set of stitches as one stitch so that you're not trying to remember a bunch of things in order. You're just trying to remember, I pop my needle through, I make the circle around the last stitch, I make one seed stitch, and that's it. Instead of trying to remember, a bunch of things in a row that are repeating, if you just memorize the 2-stitch repeat and then just do that over and over again, you are golden. I said before that the big leaf trips up a lot of my students in the beginning, but that's because they have never seen this stitch before. I like to build confidence as we move through the class, so we'll do super simple stuff in the beginning, and then we'll move on to the big leaf, which tends to trip people up. We're doing it twice, so by the time we get there, people are, think they've got a handle on it and build a little bit of confidence, and then by the time we get to the chain stitch, people have that experience of having a little bit of confidence of what they can accomplish in embroidery, and then I really throw the yellow flower at them, so I don't want to freak you out. But I just want to say that you've got this, you're going to be an expert in no time, and you can do this chain stitch. I hope you guys appreciate, everybody at home, I hope you appreciate that pep talk, because you may be an absolute expert already and have no problem with this chain stitch. But that is the pep talk I have given 1,000 times at this point in the class. And I will tell you, there has never been a student who can't get it, so I know that you can get it. So as you can see, I'm just over and over repeating those exact same stitches. Popping out my needle, threading my wool floss through the base of the last stitch, putting my needle right back from whence it came. That's the first half of my stitch. Just gonna make it look pretty before I do the second half of the stitch, where I just come through the center of that circle and come out, put it back in to the center of the next circle. So simple. I promise you guys, it's so simple. Now, when we do this the other direction, I recommend not doing it like I do it in this video. I recommend just continuing to do the exact same thing in the opposite direction. I'm trying to mirror the same thing that I did on the other side and making them look exactly the same going up. So I'm doing the stitches in reverse, but I don't recommend doing this on your own, especially if it's your first time. I think it's great to just turn your work and continue working in the exact same manner that you have just taught yourself instead of doing these upside down. I'm only doing this because I'm insane. Yes, probably because I want to show off, and I hope you're impressed by my showing off. That was just a joke. But I just think turn your work. It's much easier. I tell my students to do it all the time. Do exactly the same thing that you've just done. Just turn your work and continue as if it was an unbroken straight line. You can really mentally trip yourself up during this process, but it's actually quite simple. All right, next we are going to move on to the Goldenrod Flowers. This wool floss that I'm using, called Goldenrod, is one of my favorites. This yellow is so brilliant, and I love it. I'm going to start this flower with one big stitch through the center of my project. This flower is going to incorporate a lot of the skills that you already have. I'm going to start by setting up the setup stitches. If you notice, I started my knot in the center of the flower because once again, I don't want my knot or the little tails in my knot to stick out on the side. So if this is a flower that's going to be full of stitches, I know that if that knot is in the center, it will not be seen later on in the project. So these setup stitches that I am doing is once again creating a structure like I did with the flower that is going to help me create smaller stitches that don't start to sort of like meander or bend too quickly as they would if I was just building one stitch next to each other and trying to create a radiating line. It doesn't work very well in my experience, and I just suggest using this method that I have never read about in a book. Excuse me if it does exist in a book. I just found over years and years and years of doing this that if I create straight line structures that are, the foundation of a shape, my shape is going to look a lot more even because I can fill out in between two lines a lot better and more evenly than I can starting from one line and just stacking them on top of each other that become quite wonky quite quickly. So as you can see, I am just creating these radiating lines and then filling out straight lines beneath the previous stitches at the base of the flower. I am showing you, as I did with the last chain stitches, I am showing you a version of these stitches that are a lot larger than what I would typically do when I was doing this myself. I want you to be able to see what I'm doing here, and here's an example of how I'm taking a long stitch and creating a shorter stitch right next to it. I'm going to do that again right next to that foundation stitch, and I'm going to put a shorter stitch right next to a longer stitch. I'll do the same thing for the center line and work sort of like a radiating, oscillating fan that goes back and forth, creating longer stitches and then creating shorter stitches next to those longer stitches. And they're going to be stacked a little bit like bricks because I don't want them to be a series of like rainbow lines. I want them to be more like a burst, like a sunburst of radiating lines that are not going in an arc. And so like I was saying before, I am making these stitches a lot larger than I typically would. It's not important that you make your stitches really long or really short when you're working on your project. It's just important that you create consistent lines as you work back and forth across your flowers. So if you are making more dramatic stitches like I am here, which is what I encourage all of my students to make when they start this project, it's going to look great so long as the stitches are pretty consistent. The short stitches are similar length to the long, and the long stitches are all similar length. I'm just going back and forth making long and short stitches between the stitches that I've made. And the reason that I suggest you make this longer or shorter is only because you want to challenge yourself when you do this next time. I like to make the stitches a lot shorter because I think it has a really interesting texture when the stitches are shorter, but it has an equally lovely texture when the stitches are longer. Now, when you get closer to the top of the flower, I want you to go to the outside edge and just outline the outside of this project. The reason why we do that in this flower and not for the other ones is because the outer shape of this flower is a really important aspect of this project that gives it the consistent, very unique flower shape. And so I want that outer edge to be really defined, which is not as important when we do the leaf, for example, because it looks like a leaf. The flower looks like flower petals. For this flower, though, I really want that shape to be there. And as I go around, you'll notice I'm very conscious of how I put these stitches into the edge of my flower. I'm not going to go from one peak to another peak. I'm going to make sure that the back stitches mimic the stitches on the front because I don't want to see them at the end of my project. So they're going to look the same on the back side as they are on the inside. Next, I'm going to take each peak in the outside of my flower that I've just outlined, and I am going to create a straight line from that peak to where I want the radiating lines that I've created in the last section of this flower to meet up with the outer lines. This may be confusing, and many of my students find this confusing. The reason I'm doing this at this point is because you have a radiating V of stitches coming from the base of the flower, and then you've got the sunburst top that is radiating in different directions. And the way that we make this make sense is that we start with our foundation stitches for the top before the two sections meet each other. So right now I'm just doing the same thing I did on the bottom by making longer stitches, longer foundation stitches, that I will then fill in and go back and forth in the same manner I did the bottom stitches, but I'm just going to set up this framework now so that when the two sets of stitches that are basically heading in different directions, they can integrate together in a more flowy sort of way. You'll understand as we get closer to finishing this flower, but it's really important to me that these two parts of the flower don't look like separate parts of a flower, even though you have some very different stitch transitions very fast. So now I'm just going to go back and forth and fill in all the empty space. Before we finish the last flower, I just want to do the introductory part of this yellow flower again. And the reason why I'm showing you this is because it's a little bit closer up this time. And I also just want to give you the opportunity to see this done twice, because in all of my experience, the chain stitch is always difficult for people, but there's a certain structure to it that makes sense once you get the hang of the stitches. But what's really hard for a lot of people in my wool embroidery classes is this part of the flower, because there is like a little bit of artistry that's necessary and a little bit of vision that you need to have in order to get this flower to look like a flower. So all of these stitches that I'm making, the long ones first and then the shorter stitches afterwards, that I'm staggering so that they're not just a straight line of stitches or a straight arc of stitches, I am doing it in a radiating manner. So everything is radiating in this part of the flower from the center. And this is the thing that trips up my students a lot. As you can see on the right, this is an example of what I would do on my own and how small my stitches are, and how nice the texture looks when it's stitched really small like that. When the stitches are long and short and radiating, I am doing the exact same thing with the smaller stitches, not just when I do the long stitches. And when you have that short and long stitch next to each other that are sort of radiating from the center, it gives a large canvas, a large amount of space, a certain amount of texture that is not distracting from the overall piece, if that makes sense. If these were all equal sort of rainbow arcs of stitches instead of the staggered long and short stitches, you would have a surface that was flat but drawing a lot of attention to itself because it didn't look like a flower. I really hope that makes sense. But if you were stitching something like, for example, somebody's face, or something that is an eggplant, for example, something that is the same color throughout, you don't want it to look flat. And the way that you don't make it look flat or make it look like something it absolutely is not is you add these staggered textural stitches, and it makes a gigantic difference. I truly hope that that makes sense. It's a little bit different when I'm teaching this online than when I'm teaching it in person, because I can show you what I mean through an example. I'm going to again go back and outline the top of this flower before I integrate the two sections, because once again, I want to create a framework for the top after I create the framework and fill in the bottom. And the reason for that is because this flower is heading in two different directions, and those two directions meet in the middle, and you want those two directions, when they do meet, to flow instead of be like two very distinct parts of a flower. So I'll outline the outside again, being conscious to go in the same place so that my back of my canvas is the same as the front. This outline for this flower is really important, so don't skip this step, because if this flower were not to have this outline, it would look really messy and there would just be a lot of lines heading in a lot of different directions, and you wouldn't have that really unique outline that's really important. I said before that we want these to look natural, but the way that this flower looks natural is literally to have this outline. You must believe me on this one. So now I'm going to set up that framework from the points of the top of the flower through, I would say, the top sort of like arc shape. And the reason why you want that arc shape there is because there's sort of a point in this flower where everything starts heading in a different direction. So you're just making sure that when you create these center stitches, like I've said a million times, that they integrate flawlessly with the stitches that you've already created in the bottom half. I am going to show the entire portion of this flower. I know it's long and you can skip ahead, but I truly think that it's really important to get an idea of how this flower is created. And while you're stitching, really take the time to watch this section as you stitch, because I think it'll make more sense as you are making your own flowers to see how I create the flow between these two sections of flowers. I also want to say that once you have done this, you are the master of wool embroidery and you can do anything. I think there is a certain hurdle to this section of the project and this portion of the class, because I think sometimes people think embroidery is this very structured thing and it can only be that way, and I want to encourage you to not think that way. So we're going to do the same thing to both of our flowers before we move on to these little starburst patterns. I'm going to show you two ways to do these starbursts. When you're at this point, some people just don't want to do another hard thing and they want to do this the most simple possible way. And so I just show them this way, where I'm making long starbursts, very simple, with my thread held double. I think they look fine and they add a great kind of texture to the project. But I'll show you another way that I do it, that I do in my personal projects, and that I prefer. So when I am finishing these starbursts, because there's nothing around, you want to make sure that you are only threading your floss through the stitches that you have created and cutting off your thread so that you can't see it around there, because this thread for the Twilight wool floss is really dark and there's nothing around there, so you really don't want this floss sticking out from behind your work on the front side. And I'll go back and trim all those long threads later, but just for now, that's how I'm doing them. I am going to quickly do, while I have the Twilight on my needle, I'm going to put one or two the faux French knots in the center of my first flower. Super simple. Looks amazing. Hope you guys are enjoying this project so far. And this is an example of what your work looks like when you finish it and I don't have a camera between me and my project. I can get really close. Everything's much neater. I'm just going to go through here and trim off these last little spots that are poking out. As you can see, this knot that I have secured with my thread, my floss when I started stitching, has migrated and is now sticking out. That is definitely going to show through to the other side when I finish my project. So I'm going to show you what I do. It's so simple. I just take sewing thread, which comes in your kit, put a knot at the end, and just tack this down using a needle. This takes 3 minutes, and I know that you're probably tired at this point, and you just want to make your biscornu. But I highly recommend doing this. It takes 2 seconds. I'm just going to make a double knot before I pull my thread all the way through. I'm going to do that twice, and that is plenty to secure that knot out of the way. Like I said, I'm gonna do it twice. Wrap that needle around. You got this. Just wrap it around twice so I can secure my project, and that's not gonna pop out again. And if it does pop out again, it's because you made it, you are human, and that is what's cool about making things by hand. So don't drive yourself crazy about that stuff. Next, I'm gonna give myself about 1/2 inch of space, and I am going to fold down each one of the edges. I have done both the front and the back at this point, which you can see the front is sitting on the table, and the back I am finger pressing, which is all you need. I'm just folding over the corners first of my project. I'm going to do all 4 corners first before I start folding down the edges. Like I said, I am folding these down with just a finger press. If you use a hot iron, this line will disappear. So don't do that, please. You don't need to make these edges super crisp. One of the most amazing things about linen is that it folds really easily. So I'm gonna make this edge look really nice, and all I had to use was my fingers. So we've got the pressed under corner and then the pressed under sides, and they make these neat little edges. I've done both of those. And then the last thing I'm gonna do is just mark the center of each side, and the way that I do that is just fold it in half, and with my friction pen, just make a small little note where that center is. Don't forget the friction pen goes away with heat, so I'm not worried about getting any friction pen on the front of my project. So once I have created that mark on each of the 4 sides of the top and the bottom of my pattern, I'm going to start lining up these stitches, which might seem a little bit awkward or illogical at first, but trust me, it makes sense once you start seeing this project come together. With the 2 stitched sides facing each other, I'm going to take the corner of the top or the bottom, it doesn't matter which side is facing you, and match it up to the center of the opposite side and pin that in place, like I said, with the embroidered sides facing each other. And then I'm going to match the same on the other side, the center of the side facing you to the corner on the other side. I'm going to switch now to the embroidery needle that comes in your set, which is the sharper of the 2 needles, and I'm going to thread it in perhaps an odd way. I'm going to take the doubled up thread and poke it through the eye of the needle and then pass it through the tip before securing it at the bottom. The reason why I do this is so that it doesn't move around, which it does if you just simply put the thread through the eye of the needle. This is the best hack you will ever learn, I promise. So I'm going to start by hiding my thread in the knot behind the corner that I've pressed down, and begin by just whip stitching in the 2 places where I have pinned, between the 2 places I have pinned my project. So that's from the corner where it matches up to the center to the other corner where it matches the center. And when I get to the corner, I'm just going to make a little double knot there so that my threads and the tension between them don't mess up as I switch from side to side as I stitch it. So I just want to have an anchor point at each of the corners. So I'll just end, I won't cut my thread, I'll just end the corner with a double knot. So now I'm just going to slightly rotate the top and now match up the rest of that side from the center to the corner now to the other side, which is the corner to the center. And I'll just do the same thing I did before, doing a simple whip stitch connecting the 2 sides. And I'll remove the pins as I work, as they're no longer necessary. And just work from one corner to the center of the next side. I'll do the same thing all the way around until I have one more side and one corner left. At that point, I'm going to flip this inside out and press out all of these corners that I have created here. Make sure you do press them out before you start adding the batting. This batting that I'm using is just organic cotton. The batting that you choose is up to you. I didn't include it in the kit because it would just cost $1 million to ship. And different people like different kinds of filling. I prefer this traditional old-fashioned cotton, but if you use the polyfill, it'll fill out these corners and make your project a lot fluffier. So I'm going to fill this up, but also press down in the center just to make sure that things are sitting the way that they are going to when I add the center stitch. You want to make sure there's enough of the fluff and the cotton batting inside each corner because you don't want any of the corners to be just fabric and sort of limp. So when I do this, I'm just going to use my fingers at first, but if you want to use a stuffing tool, if you have these, it's really helpful, especially if you're using just regular cotton, to move that cotton to the corners and really make it stick in there. Again, I'm just going to press through the center to see how it looks and see if there's any soft places that I can add more cotton. But like I said, if you use the polyfill, a lot of times it's going to fill out those corners a little bit easier. It's just puffy plastic, so I just prefer not to use it. I like the old-timey look. Obviously, I'm a natural dyer. I like everything to be old. So once it gets as full as I like it, I'm going to just finish this last side by stitching back and forth, and I'm going to use more pins than I normally would, just because getting these last side even is really important. So I'm going to sew about half of this last side before I check again and see if I need any more of the filling so that everything is as full as I like it, even at the point where it comes to the final edge that I'm sewing at the moment. So as you can see, once I add some stuff, it looks actually quite weak. And so I need to add up until the last stitch. And then when I have finished, I'm going to move it all around, make sure that all that wool is in the right place before I add the absolute final stitches, and it is all stitched up. Look at how gorgeous this looks, guys. This is the most luxurious pin keep. What do you think? I love it. Next, I'm going to take my double knot and a double held thread and push the needle through the center of my biscornu, popping out on the right side of the X on the front, leaving a small tail behind, and pushing it through the stitches, the embroidery stitches on the front, and then back through on the other side of the X, hidden behind the stitches, using a thimble. Trust me, you need it for this step. And then pop it back through, and then catch with your thread the end of that double knot so that you have something to pull the thread through and it's caught on the other side. I am making this knot like ridiculously large for this example. When you do it, it's not going to be this large, but I wanted it to show up on this video. So I'm going to knot that knot together and then pull that thread through and just tug on it till the knot pops through to the other side. This is still visible because the knot is so huge. Yours will not be. But look at that. It is secured. It is gorgeous. Look what you've made. I am so proud of you. Before we end, I want to suggest that as you go through and stuff, you will notice that there might be some parts of your biscornu when you put it together that are not as tight anymore. So using a single thread, I am going to go through, and I just highly recommend all my students do this. I'm just going to make an invisible stitch around that seam all the way around to tighten those stitches and just make this look really tight and neat and finished. You're going to have this for a long time and you want it to look fantastic, so go ahead and do this step. The very last thing we need to do is take a hot hair blow dryer and just heat the marks that we've made with the friction pen so that they disappear. And look at that. Look what you've made. It looks so wonderful. I love this project so much. My husband told me it's the most gorgeous thing I've ever made. So I am very proud of it, and I hope that you are proud as well. So please, If you liked this video, do that thing that everybody else on the planet asks you to do, which is to like and subscribe. But also, check out stuartmoorestextiles.com, where you can find lots of other patterns and wool embroidery floss that is plant dyed, as well as a range of other plant dyed things and other kinds of floss, including cotton and stitching cloth and linens and lots of plant dyed colors. So thank you again, and we'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.